There we go. Great. Well, I can see everyone joining now. A few housekeeping points before we start. There is a comments box. There is a Q&A function. So please do feel free as we go through today's session to drop any thoughts, questions, reflections that you have in the chat function so everyone can see. And please do feel free to ask questions at any time. It'll be a pretty relaxed session today, so we'll be taking them as they come through. So don't feel you have to wait for Q&A at the end. Drop them through and we'll address them as we go. I think we're probably about ready to start, I think. Great. Okay, cool. We've got enough people in, I think, now. Let's begin. So yeah, welcome everyone. As I said, my name's Alex. I'm the Global Insights Content Manager. I'm joined today by Shreyas. Shreyas, do you want to give a quick introduction? Shreyas actually sat next to me, but we're in a meeting room.
Yeah, hello. Shreyas, my pronouns are Hide, and I'm the Insights and Content Analyst here. And I report to Alex, so I basically do everything that Alex tells me to do. But basically, doing more serious everything on data research training, and my background lies in economics and international relations, which was research intensive. So I've basically combined my love for research and my love for the LGBT+ community together. Now I work here.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Yeah, and I suppose my background for those that don't know me, I sort of cut my teeth doing due diligence work on the agency side for sort of KYC for banking as a grad, and then moved into consulting. Spent a couple of years doing management consulting, and then I'm now head up the research and data side here at LGBT Great. And the conversation today is really all around IDAHOBIT and the origin of it, the importance of it. We'll talk about a little bit about what it is, why it still matters. Just to continue briefly on LGBT Great, for those that don't know us, we are a member organization for financial services, focusing on empowering organizations to build momentum and maturity in LGBTQ+ DE&I across the firm. We work through a range of research, benchmarking and data programs, and we have a range of visibility programs as well, industry facing and sort of internally within organizations. And then we have a series of outreach and community programs that cover off events, mentoring, and community building. So yeah, if you don't know any, if you've not engaged with us before and you'd like to learn more, then please do feel free to reach out to us directly. I'm happy to talk you through any of those aspects in kind of more detail, depending on where your organization is at the moment. IDAHOBIT, so the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Transphobia is the topic today. And really when building the materials for this session to talk through it with you all today, I came across this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and it really resonated, I think, with us here at LGBT Great when thinking about why today matters from an IDAHOBIT perspective. And I think it is really the relationship here between hate and darkness and light, etc. And the idea here that only love can be that bridge, I think is an interesting one. And not to get too soppy, but I do think that on today, when we're talking about phobia, and we will be talking about some quite heavy things today briefly, I think it's important to remember that quotes like this, people like this are trying, and certainly we are trying as well to help the industry and more broadly. With that, I should probably then note there is a slight content warning for today's session. We will be talking about mental health issues impacting the LGBTQ+ community. There will be mention of some self-harm and also of suicide as well. And so if that is triggering to you at any point, or please do feel free to drop off the call at that point. But apart from that, there shouldn't really be other sort of content warnings that I needed to give. But it is, I suppose we should address that really, in that it's a tough one. Talking about IDAHOBIT, it is a series of issues that are real, tangible, real world, continued, sustained, that impact the LGBTQ+ community daily, and that are really awful and need to change. And that's what today is about. It's about raising awareness, driving education, and sort of catalyzing change. What is IDAHOBIT? You may know this, you may not know this. I'm not sure where you sit on that spectrum from today, but IDAHOBIT really was born out of a need, a global need, to draw attention to the violence and discrimination experienced by LGBTQ plus people and communities globally. It was aim, as we say here, was to, quote, coordinate international events to raise awareness. And I think that's really the crucial thing here. IDAHOBIT was born to raise awareness, to have that awareness be driven through events, through multinational, interfirm, community-wide events, and to spark conversation in places where it might be challenging to do so effectively. It was born in 1990, off the back of the World Health Organization declassifying homosexuality as a mental, quote, mental disorder. Up until then, it had been seen as a mental condition, a disease. I think it's been said in the past. And the WHO was really critical when this decision was made to declassify homosexuality here. It changed the entire narrative. And I think, Trey, you and I are going to talk a little bit around the relationship that has with phobia in a bit. But in the years between 1990 and 2004, we really saw an increase in engagement around discrimination, a legitimization of conversations about LGBTQ plus people. And in 2004, there was a long campaign which culminated in the launching of something called the IDAHO initiative, and International Day Against Homophobia. And that was really the kind of first stage of the conversation, was really to acknowledge that homophobia exists, acknowledge that homophobia is something that needs to be tackled directly, head on, in a targeted fashion by an international community coming together towards a kind of common cause. I'm sure many of you have noticed that the IDAHOBIT is now the acronym of choice. There's been discussion around the inclusion of an L to IDAHOBLIT, which is a very interesting conversation, and perhaps we can touch on that if people have questions around that. But essentially, what has happened over the last few years is kind of an increased push towards a nuanced conversation around homophobia and general LGBTQ plus phobia. The first was with the addition of T, to explicitly acknowledge that transphobia is a unique experience that is rooted in potentially slightly different prejudices and etc. Compared with homophobia. So it was important to acknowledge that trans folk, non-binary folk experience that discrimination in a slightly different fashion to kind of cisgendered members of the community. And then, I'm sure we've all known that from a representation point of view, gay men and gay women typically are the most represented in conversations about LGBTQ plus things. You see that in organizational pride networks. You see that in other conversations, that's the first voice that's heard. And in 2015, there was really a focus on, the B and the P, pansexuality as well, as part of the umbrella of bisexual identity. That was explicitly added because there was an acknowledgement of an underrepresentation of, bi people in this conversation, in the same way that trans folks needed an additional boost of visibility. The same is true of bi and pan folks as well. So, the event, I suppose, that the global push has changed and has become slightly more nuanced as time has gone on. But the root of it, the goal of IDAHOBIT remains the same, which is to acknowledge, tackle, and ultimately get rid of anti-LGBTQ plus phobia. So that's kind of a brief whistle-stop tour through the kind of origin of IDAHOBIT. I suppose you may be sat there thinking, well, 1990 was a long time ago, 2004 was quite a long time ago. Why is this conversation still important? Haven't we made great progress? And the short answer is yes, we have made great progress. The longer answer is that there's still a lot further that we need to go. When putting this slide pack together, we had to acknowledge, that 67 jurisdictions continue to criminalize private consensual same-sex activity. So, criminalizing being LGBTQ plus. 14 still criminalize someone expressing their gender in a way that does not necessarily relate to their gender that was assigned at birth. This is particularly the case, obviously, for trans and non-binary folks. And so it's 14 countries in the world where that's still criminalizable. There is still penal code that denies people that expression. And then 11 countries in the world still have capital punishment for being LGBTQ+, right? So this is something that in many places in the world is still a factor from a jurisdictional and legislative point of view. But more broadly, even in places that quote unquote would seem to be more progressive from an LGBT inclusion perspective, we're seeing a lot of erosion in those rights and protections that had previously been established. 327, the number of reported murders of trans folks in the US documented, or globally. I think this is actually a global figure. But as we know, trans non-binary folks are not necessarily always going to be, those are not going to be reported in certain places. So we expect the number to be very much higher. So, violence is still prevalent for the LGBTQ plus community. Discrimination is still very prevalent. 70% according to my G work, 70% of LGBTQ plus women and non-binary professionals have experienced discrimination at work. 70%. That's kind of globally, and we think that that's obviously something that needs to change. We've seen a lot of protests, a lot of anti-LGBTQ plus discussions that have been happening around the world. So, I mean, for us at LGBT Great, there's no, this conversation remains just as important as it did, 100 years ago, and then throughout the pre-Stonewall, Stonewall, and the post-Stonewall era, and now into this kind of new wave of anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment that we're kind of seeing. I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not necessarily new, and this has kind of been the case for a while. I do think that in the last couple of years, there has been a marked increase in the rhetoric, in the media coverage, in kind of external aspects here. So I do think that kind of the visibility of anti-LGBTQ plus aspects, rhetoric, and sentiment is definitely increasing, which is obviously worrying. But I think further underscores the fact that IDAHOBIT remains a really important visibility day where we need to talk about this, acknowledge that it's still an issue, and to work together as a community to kind of overcome this. It's quite a lot of talking from me. Shrey, do you want to come in here? For those that don't know, Shrey leads on our news and editorial pieces, including our fortnightly LGBTQ plus news digest, which if you don't get, I have to plug. So the 5 LGBTQ plus stories you need to know about, where we look at global trends, we look at changes in legislation, we look at policy, and that sort of thing. So if you're interested, drop me a note, and we can always have a conversation about that. And you can also get the newsletter. But as part of this, Shrey has your finger on the pulse in terms of what's happening. And I know that we wanted today not to just be about all the bad stuff. And I think it's very clear that there continues to be all of the challenges that the community face, but there are some good things out there as well. So Shrey, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I feel good about the fact that you got all the bad stuff away, and now I can speak about the good stuff. That's reassuring for me. But for example, like we were just seeing like the main progress that we've seen over the last year in terms of LGBT plus protections. So starting with the US, the first thing that they did, I think in December, was like federally enshrine same-sex marriage into law, which I think was a very big step, because after the Roe v. Wade got rolled back, the country needed some sort of reassurance, especially the LGBTQ plus community. So it's great to see the US do that. Moving on to Spain, which is relatively recent, only in February, where the self-determination law became approved by the parliament, and that was great because now people over the age of 16 can get gender recognition certificates very easily. Cook Islands, this was, I think, the last digest or the second last digest, but Cook Islands very recently effectively decriminalized homosexuality, which is good because like Cook Islands is very politically connected with like New Zealand and Australia, and of course they're making strides in LGBTQ plus protection, and good to see that the ripple effect. And going back to Europe, we talk about Finland, again, Finland did something very similar to Spain, and basically they trans and non-binary people don't need proof of sterilization, quote unquote, to legally change their gender, which is, I think, a great step forward. And England, the Church of England voted in favor of same-sex unions, which is honestly a very just when I read that, I was so pleased, because I was like, yes, even like people who are religious can also understand the value of being just human, and that's what exactly religion preaches: being human, being kind. And I that, but yeah, these are all things that I've witnessed in terms of like macro trends, because I've been doing this the last 6 months and just having a sense of what's happening around the world. And I think there's, again, I mean, we talk about the fight against homophobia, against transphobia, against biphobia. Like, seeing all of this is always, I see it as like a shining light, which is very encouraging for me. But back to you, Alex. Something that you need to add.
Thanks, Ray. No, I mean, I think in the whole conversation around global trends, I think what we're seeing is a series of macro trends. As you mentioned, we're seeing great strides being made from the legitimization of LGBTQ plus pro legislation. We're seeing acknowledgement of gender recognition certificates for trans and non-binary folks being made more accessible. We're seeing the conversation start to shift in places where historically there has been a legacy of, you and I talk about this a lot, a legacy of colonialism in places like Singapore, with the repeal of 377A, the penal code, the legacy penal code that sort of criminalized same-sex sexual acts. So, we're seeing a lot of transition here, a lot of pro movement, a lot of marginal gains, a lot of small steps. I still think there's a need for bigger, splashier change, and I think the role that LGBTQ plus people play in organizations, as policymakers, and indeed the role that allies play in trying to drive the conversation forward in spaces where LGBTQ plus people may not have the same level of power or access is really important. But I think it is really encouraging on IDAHOBIT to remember that there is positive progress happening, although sometimes it might feel like it's being overwhelmingly overshadowed by the bad stuff. It is important to remember that the progress is being seen globally, which I think is very encouraging. That's back to us. I mean, that was it really in terms of the history of IDAHOBIT, and the fact that it was born out of a global acknowledgement of the need to have conversations in a different fashion, to drive those conversations to policymakers and advocates. But it's a pretty simple conversation in terms of tracking the history. The impact, though, of IDAHOBIT is multifaceted, sustained, and has a real tangible reflection in the real world. We see organizationally as LGBT Great a lot conversations around discrimination and around policy change as an organizational level. And so as a microcosm of broader society organizations, we're seeing increased sensitivity towards these types of topics, especially around discrimination, which is great. But I'm happy to take any questions at this point, just around IDAHOBIT generally, or around the work that we do. But in the last sort of 20 minutes of today's session, Shrey and I wanted to just spend a little bit of time talking about some of the issues that we see as being very important this IDAHOBIT. And I suppose, Shrey, we mentioned earlier around this idea that phobia is kind of central. And I know that you have been doing some research on the origin of phobia as an idea and the impact and legacy that phobias continue to have on the community. I wondered if you could tell the folks a little bit about what you've been sort of focusing on recently.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, I'm very interested in studying phobias generally. Also, I have arachnophobia and acrophobia, which is not great, but basically I'm like scared of spiders and heights. Basically, if we just go to the definition of phobia generally, which was, I think, coined in around 1950s, initial 1950s. It was just an irrational fear. But talking about homophobia specifically, it was only in, and I think this reminds me of the fact that knowledge is always ever evolving. So even like till 1973, DSM-2, which is like the psychiatric manual from published in the US, and basically is the world's leading standard, classified homosexuality as a disease. But in 1971, after a paper by Weinberg, the perspective really shifted, and homophobia actually became not the quote unquote like an illness, but something that was not acceptable for the norm, but homosexuality became a normal thing. It became the norm, which is very important because before that, that just shows that how knowledge changed, and people who identify as homosexual or who are like part of the LGBTQ plus community started being incorporated into the norm. But then moving on, I think like from a psychosocial perspective, it is very interesting to see how homophobia actually functions and what facets drive homophobia. So there's a scientist called Herrera, researcher in 2007, if I'm not wrong. He gave an idea, he gave like a definition of heterosexism instead of homophobia, which is a shift in the term. But again, it's very specifically esoteric to be fair, but the idea was that institutional practices get, so basically an ideology where heteronormativity is at the forefront and institutional practices get translated into disadvantaging sexual minorities, which is very interesting because what it essentially entails is the fact that the moment we see heteronormativity as a norm is also the moment we slightly feel out of group. So we talk about in-group bias and out-group bias, the same goes. So quote unquote disease / unnatural only becomes when something is out of the ordinary or something is unnatural in some ways and form. And he based all of this on like 3 principles. It was enacted sexual stigma, which is basically insults and attacks on sexual minorities. Then the second one, which I find really interesting personally, is felt sexual stigma, which is basically you change or modify your behavior to fit into the norm, which is again the heteronormativity. And I have personally felt that because growing up in India, I always felt like I had to, like there was a certain gender norm, a certain like norm around sexual orientations that I had to fit into. And I like as someone who's growing up, you see people around you and you want to fit in. So I've personally done that. And I felt like I personally read that definition. I was like, okay, I felt this. And then there's the third one, which I think is the most problematic and probably the most entrenched in many people, which is internalized sexual stigma, where you basically put in the negative evaluation of another community into your own value systems and beliefs. And that's like the final kind of like stage where I think it's very harmful because every value that you associate with normativity is outside of the LGBTQ plus community, which is in itself a problem. But yeah, I was just going on about, sorry about that, but that was a pretty long definition of everything that's been occurring in the last 40, 50 years in psychosocial studies. But I also think that here, one thing that I keep thinking about is like the cultural differences and the cultural nuance that comes in. I don't know. I feel like I've been going on for a while.
No, that's absolutely fine. I mean, it was really interesting to hear you plot that history and those 3 different sort of interrelated aspects. The one thing that really struck me was this idea of proximity to knowledge to fear, right? So I think you and I have talked a lot about, and anyone who's joined our trainings know that, I like this idea of proximity bias as a lens onto how discrimination at work kind of manifests. We talk about it often in the context of allyship as well. So proximity bias, you are more likely to engage with or have a bias towards things that are closer to you. That could be physical proximity, but it can also be an intellectual or emotional connection. In the context of LGBTQ plus people, if you don't know anyone who's LGBTQ plus, if you have no one in your immediate frame of reference who's LGBTQ plus, the issues that impact the community probably feel quite distant to you. And so the first point in tackling phobia, any of those three parts of the phobia that you just mentioned, the first point is around bringing those issues closer to you, which breaks down, some of that fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what's distant, or that sort of idea. And so breaking down those barriers and trying to work on bringing those issues closer to you, whether that's through education, engagement, talking to people, watching films, social media, etc., etc. That forms at least some of the work that we do. One of the things around breaking down the root of homophobia and of biphobia and of transphobia, which in many cases is ignorance. So if you understand someone, you're much more likely to be empathetic towards them, you're much more likely to champion them. And hopefully that then means that any biases that you may have had that then manifest in discrimination or homophobic microaggressions or macroaggressions, are reduced, or at least, begin to reduce. So, I mean, that's just what I was reflecting on as you were speaking. But you did pick up on a really interesting point there around cultural relativity, and the idea is different in different places. And obviously, there's no secret, you and I talk about India and the UK quite a lot, and you've worked in both environments. We now do training on LGBTQI, and we talk a lot about the relative differences between India and the UK. I was just wondering, in the context of this conversation around homophobia and the global context, what are your thoughts on your experience in both of those environments?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have lived experience in both the countries in terms of working, and yes, I do have opinions. But I want to start with the fact that, I mean, just going back to phobia for a second, about how phobia is like an irrational fear in a definition. But then there's two kinds of, for example, I am afraid of spiders, or I'm afraid of heights, but that is a genetically sequenced phobia that we have. But then there's another phobia which is culturally constructed, and I think that is what like any kind of phobia against the LGBTQ plus community or any underrepresented community actually comes from. Cultural constructions, and the reproduction of norms in all ways and form. And as I worked in India, of course, I mean, this is very, if you go back to the history of the Indian Peninsula, and our mythology, our gods, whatever, they're very androgynous, very LGBTQ plus, very cool, to be fair, at least for me. And then now I think, because as a lot of things have changed, there's different perspectives that have come about in India, and I don't want to delve into the political aspects, but working there, of course, I always felt like there was a difference in acceptance, which I don't feel here as much, because of course this country is more accepting in that way. And when I used to work in India, of course, there was we just decriminalized same-sex marriage, same-sex relations. And I mean, of course, this was a taboo topic to think about. And I also feel legally, of course, you decriminalize something, but the social norm, changing the social norm takes a lot longer. And I think that is even the case for countries which very recently have decriminalized anything, in terms of LGBTQ plus community, because there's still a certain norm that is predisposed in everyone's minds. But yeah, working there, I always felt culturally it was slightly different. I was never my authentic self at work. And I think my mental health was also affected by that, because I could never be who I am. But here, of course, it's different. And I think it's partly because I work in an organization that only talks about LGBTQ plus community, which my day job and my gay job is basically the same, which is amazing. But yeah, it did affect my mental health. And as it is Mental Health Awareness Week, I actually want to talk about mental health. What do you think, how is mental health important in the workplace, and even generally broader in a broader spectrum. What do you think, Alex? I would love to hear.
Thanks, Trey. I mean, just to come back to some of those points that you made around the cultural relativity point of view, I think it's really, really interesting listening to you talk about, the kind of cultural legacy of, gender non-conforming individuals mythologically, in literature and things, and then to see that that's not ever translated into kind of overt support. You and I talk a lot about like some I've heard it said some kind of people call it third gender communities, but essentially those that are gender non-conforming, gender queer, non-binary, and there are lots of documented instances of amazing communities that exist all across different parts of the world. We talked about India, we've talked about in the Cook Islands and in the Maori cultures and things, that the conceptualization of gender is much more nuanced in some places, and that obviously then feeds into the the sense of phobia or lack of phobia. And actually, we've got a question that's come through that someone said around internalized homophobia due to nurture and environmental aspects. And that's very interesting because in the environments where there is a very strong sense of gender nonconformity, historically, culturally, obviously the sense of internalization is very different. The influence is very different. When thinking about internalized homophobia, when thinking about structural oppression, when thinking about legacy, and those sorts of things, environmental factors, religious factors, socio-political factors, I think one thing to remember is that, the first step in combating internalized homophobia is self-discovery, introspection, and awareness. There has to be a point at which something happens, a spark, a catalyst for change in perspective. That in many cases, that's someone calling you out or calling someone in, or you suddenly realizing that people around you are part of that community that you, have obviously got internalized biases towards. And so internalized homophobia will remain, and let's not let's call a spade, and internalized homophobia is real and will continue to be present for many people, unfortunately. But the way that that's tackled is by sort of sparking moments of mindset shift. That's partly our role in organizations, is to talk about these types of things, to try and help people to identify that they have got some internalized perceptions, some of which may be classed as internalized homophobia. And that's kind of the first point here, which is that if you have an opportunity to talk about LGBTQ plus issues, if you have an opportunity to educate someone, if you have an opportunity to call someone in, rather than call someone out in an aggressive sense, but if you can talk to them about the issue, why using someone's correct pronouns matters, why, those sorts of things, then you build an opportunity for that person to, one, identify that they have internalized homophobia, which is kind of the first step in moving, talk about stages of different things, grief, etc., growth. The first step is self-discovery, awareness, and introspection. It is important, as this person who is the question who's asked this question has said, around nurture and environmental factors. That's obviously the case. Hopefully we can see in certain instances where, at school and things, that relationships and friendships and those sorts of things can be built on an LGBTQ plus inclusive foundation. In places where they can't, LGBTQ plus people must look elsewhere to find support, emotional or otherwise. We did a report at the beginning of this year, Seeing is Believing, the power of role models and visibility, in partnership with City. And we found that that those individuals who have experienced discrimination, that have grown up in an environment where being LGBTQ plus is not necessarily the case, look towards social media to find role models. One of the things that we found. I feel like I'm rambling off topic here, but I do want to come back to your point, Shreyas, around mental health. I thought it was good to just address this internalized homophobia piece very quickly. But this is all tied in together. It's also National Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK, I think maybe globally. And internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, everything that we're talking about that's relevant to IDAHOBIT, as I said at the beginning of this session, has a material impact on people. Sometimes that's physical, with physical violence, but the majority of instances has an emotional and mental impact, first and foremost. And I think it's worth really acknowledging that LGBTQ plus people are disproportionately likely to, one, experience discrimination and violence, but two, have more mental health conditions or more serious mental health conditions, and ultimately, are more likely to, make attempts on their own life, etc. A recent very good study by the Trevor Project in the US on LGBTQ plus mental health found that 41% of LGBTQ plus young people seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. And 56% of LGBTQ plus young people who wanted mental health care in the past year were not able to get it, while 1 in 3 young people said mental health was poor most of the time due to anti-LGBTQ plus issues such as policy, etc. So, I mean, just the stats alone speak volumes of the reality that the community faces. Part of this is tied up in internalized homophobia. Part of this is tied up in culturally relative aspects. Part of this is tied up in anti-LGBT and homophobic systematic and systemic structures. And we can all talk about oppression and privilege and all these big, complex and nuanced topics. But the reality is that IDAHOBIT and conversations like this continue to matter because so many young LGBTQ plus people are, want for better words, still suffering, and I think that's what's really important to acknowledge. What are some of the other stats? That 65% of trans and non-binary respondents who reported being on gender affirming hormones in care said that they were somewhat or very concerned about losing access to this care. Mental health and mental well-being is tied up into structures, access to healthcare, access to support, access, etc., etc. And where that's not there, whether that's in an organization or in a community or in a nation, it has a really severe, sustained and detrimental impact on kind of young people. So I think, Shrey, to answer your question around IDAHOBIT and mental health and the relationship with it, I think it's important to acknowledge the challenges that still exist, but also acknowledge that there is support out there on IDAHOBIT. Part of this is based on education. Part of this is based on having access to the right communities. And part of it is based on, having allies and others around you who can, use their power and privilege and status in certain instances to help you, spotlight you, give you, the same access and the same abilities to succeed as others. In DEI conversations, there's always a conversation around diversity, equity, equality, inclusion, well-being, belonging, all this sort of stuff. But the things that I always want to talk about is equality and equity, and how equity is about how different people may experience support, may have different access given to them in different ways to ensure that they can still reach the same opportunities and that others have. I often talk about the ladder model. Trey, you've heard me talk about this a lot, but the idea is that everyone wants to get the same apple, right? Everyone eats the same apple. Lovely apple, great, 10 out of 10. Everyone's very different, in terms of the apple is up on the tree. Everyone's arms are different lengths. Everyone's different heights. Everyone can jump higher or not as high, etc., etc. That's diversity, right? Equality is saying that everyone gets to eat the apple. That's it. Everyone gets to eat the apple. End of. Equity is about saying, well, people can't reach the apple for different reasons, so let's support them in different ways to ensure that they get the same equality and equity of outcome, which is the apple. By and this is that concept here, is that equity and equality is really important. Equity for LGBTQ plus people means giving additional support to make sure that those outcomes become the same as someone who might not be LGBTQ plus. From a mental health point of view and from an IDAHOBIT point of view, that means sustained work around access to support, whether that's, in-person support, virtual support, etc., etc. Whether that's formal networks that help LGBTQ plus people, donating to charities, all this sort of stuff that feeds into this positive feedback loop around support. And so I think this Mental Health Awareness Week in IDAHOBIT, it's really important to reflect on why phobias continue to exist, internalized homophobia, environmental factors, but that there are opportunities through education, through awareness, through self-introspection, through discovery, all of that stuff, to offset those, to start a series of growth patterns, and then to drive change across the world. I'm getting ahead of myself and rambling a bit, but Shreya, I hope that kind of outlines a little bit of at least my thoughts around the relationship between mental health and kind of why IDAHOBIT kind of matters. What are your thoughts?
No, I mean, I completely agree, because I don't think anything exists in a vacuum. I mean, just looking at like 1 in 3 people being affected mentally just because of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation just says itself that mental health and phobia are directly related, because if someone's not accepting you, someone's not letting you have the same rights as the others, your mental health would naturally be affected. So I think everything that you said just resonated with me completely. I completely agree. But in the interest of time, I think we should also think about like what organizations can do. And I'll leave you to it, because
Oh no, that's a good segue. It's almost as if we prepared a slide to talk about it, and we have. But I mean, some of this conversation can feel a bit nebulous, can feel a bit philosophical, can feel a bit abstract. But we wanted to, in the last few minutes, really just share a few thoughts with you on what organizations can do to kind of tackle some of these challenges. And I'm sure people on the call today are managers or leaders, network leads or senior people or junior people with access and drive. So some of these things may be relevant. All of them might be relevant, but essentially there are things that companies, particularly within financial services, can do to tackle homophobia, biphobia, lesbophobia, transphobia, discrimination, etc., etc. Obviously, the first step is policy and protection at the firm-wide level, robust implemented governance to enshrine protections for LGBTQ plus people. That there needs to be a baseline. But reviewing and auditing and updating those policies, particularly around topics like non-binary inclusion and trans inclusion at work, is really difficult for organizations. And we find in our conversations that companies don't always know that once they've got a discrimination policy, that they probably should actually double check it. It should be an audited, rolling process. So the first thing is to make sure that bedrock of policy is robust, is strong, and is continually being reviewed. But obviously that's hopefully a given. Beyond that, the first thing is around driving the conversation. These are not in any necessary particular order of importance, but driving the conversation internally and externally around this, breaking down that barrier around knowledge gaps, bringing those issues closer to people, whether that's through formal awareness programs. You can get in touch with LGBT Great to find out more. I have to say that. Or whether it's through informal mentoring and programs or social media or storytelling, how an organization tackles building awareness and understanding around LGBTQ plus topics is kind of crucial to offsetting organizational, phobia that exists within a kind of organizational context. Data monitoring, ESG strategy, social, CSR, all of these other things that support empowerment of the community, that help organizations to make decisions about internal and external communities, are also really important, but fundamentally are nice to have is not the right word, but they are probably the next step 2 in the process. Step 1 is around the policy foundation, building awareness and driving the conversation. Step 2 is about integrating that and that sensitivity into wider programs throughout an organization, such as ESG strategy, such as DEI data collection and monitoring and employee feedback and all those sorts of things. And then once that's kind of happened and the internal piece has really started, then tailoring products and services so that they're LGBTQ plus inclusive for clients and partners is then the goal, I suppose, in that organizations then become advocates. They empower the community through the products and services that they begin to offer. If I can send one message to everyone on the call today, it's that all of this organizational stuff matters, and whatever influence you have over this, please get involved, be LGBTQ plus pro in the conversations you have. But fundamentally, combating phobia begins with individuals. It begins with each person acknowledging that they won't stand up for it, that they will call it out if they see it. But also there's an onus on educating oneself around what my biases might be, what my perception is. Do I have any phobias? Does the idea of being LGBTQ plus make me go, oh, I wouldn't want to be LGBTQ plus, things like that. It's taking a moment to actually think about, what does being LGBTQ plus mean to me if I'm not part of the community? And if you are part of the community, it's about understanding that you are also a potential ally for an underrepresented part of the community that you might not belong to. So for example, we do a lot of work trying to raise awareness around trans and non-binary issues, because it's so important, and there's not always a trans and non-binary person who can speak for themselves. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. So we are able to leverage the platform that we have to talk about those issues, and that's part of the formula for breaking down phobia, which is, if I'm making a formula up, it's probably sustained action plus education. Is probably two of the things that really break that down. And yeah, so I think those are some things that organizations can do. That's a little bit around how IDAHOBIT was born, why IDAHOBIT still matters. A few thoughts from Shreyas and I on why IDAHOBIT continues to matter globally, and then also that IDAHOBIT is so integrally linked with mental health. And this Mental Health Awareness Week, it's really important to understand the relationship between phobia, mental health, and the support that the LGBTQ plus community continues to need. And that organizations have a really strong ability to drive change internally and then externally. So I suppose that's what we wanted to say today. Shrey, over to you for any kind of final thoughts, really.
No, I mean, I just want to say that all of these, like ESG strategy, culture, data, each of these, we have like a session for every one of those, and we can delve more deep into it, because of course this was only like a 2-minute brief. But yeah, that's it. Like all of these things are very important, very crucial, and I hope people can do some action, take some action, spotlight people from the LGBTQ plus community, become a strong ally, and take something away from the session.
Excellent sales pitch, 10 out of 10. Yeah, I mean, we do have sessions and training on all of these topics. So I mean, if you are a member of LGBT Great, corporate member, then this can be part of your package from a training point of view. If you're not part of LGBT Great as a corporate member, then we can offer training on all of these things plus others as well. So please do get in touch if you would like to learn a bit more about that. That's the sales pitch over. We do actually, it's not the sales pitch over. We do also have a dedicated session this year that we're running on for Pride, which is called A Bedrock of Solidarity, LGBTQ plus Pride and Intersectional Allyship. So we have a dedicated session this year looking at what does it mean to be an intersectional ally, not just of non-LGBTQ plus people being allies for LGBTQ plus people, but also within the community. What does that mean? So yeah, if you're interested in anything like that, then do get in touch with Shrey or I, and we can talk you through what those options might be. But yeah, just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today, and for your questions, which have been fabulous. Great to see such an engaged audience, and I hope that was helpful in giving you a bit of color around why IDAHOBIT matters and the global context in which it continues to be so important. So from LGBT Great, thanks for joining, and wishing you a great IDAHOBIT and Mental Health Awareness Week, and be part of the change. I know that's not a slogan that we have, but maybe it's one that we should have. But yeah, anyway, thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of the week.